What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, Trill Bro Dude, and unfortunately, about an hour of this podcast that I just recorded is now moot because Kyrie Irving has opted into his contract with the Brooklyn Nets. He will stay with them for at least one more year. I had Reed Wallach of Slop Fest fame from when the Harden trade went down, reacting to it, becoming a meme after that, all that fun stuff. He came back on and we talked about some Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving trades and kind of just discussed the whole thing with the Lakers and whether it was a negotiation tactic, which he thought it was. And he turned out to be right because Kyrie obviously opting back in takes all of this off of the table. None of it is relevant anymore. But look, it happens in the world of slop. Unfortunately, these things happen when it's based around the 24/7 news cycle. So we still do have a great podcast today. It's going to be much shorter than I wanted. I had Keith Parish of Fastbreak Breakfast on to talk about De'Anthony Melton, the newest Sixer, and we talked about what he will bring to the table for the team. Unfortunately, I'll probably have to podcast a few more times this week just to make up for the fact that it's slop week. I can't just do a Melton pod, and I can't just do maybe talking a little bit about PJ Tucker up top, which I do want to touch on, by the way. Everyone who follows this podcast knows I've never been the biggest PJ Tucker fan. I do think he's a solid player, but I've always felt like he's a little bit overrated as a role player. Well, it does sound like he's going to be a Sixer at 37 years old. They're going to offer him a 3-year, $30 million contract. We don't know the details of that yet, but it does seem like that is almost a guarantee at this point. Who knows? Everything could be a fucking guarantee and not happen, like Kyrie going to the Lakers. I'm not bitter at all about any of this, but it does sound like James Harden, who originally was reported was opting into his contract and would extend, could potentially move some money around, make his deal a little bit bigger on the other side so that it gives the Sixers a little bit of flexibility this year as opposed to in the next few years. So if that does happen, that's pretty much the only way that the Sixers can get to that mid-level extension number, which is almost impossible if Harden doesn't take a pay cut, because they'd either have to move Thibault, Korkmaz, and Niang for veterans minimum players, basically, or they would have to trade Tobias Harris, which seems increasingly impossible in this market, with the amount of money he makes and the lack of assets that the Sixers have. So heading into next year, it does look like it's going to be at least the starting five will probably be Maxey, Harden, Tucker, Tobias, Embiid, with Melton as the sixth man, which is a very good top six. I'm not upset with that at all. We'll see what happens with the other guys. I think they would like to move on from Korkmaz. Maybe they'd move on from Thibault. Who knows? But I think the important thing, and this is something I mentioned in this part of the podcast with Keith, which is just getting two-way players. And I feel like the Sixers have at least 4 or 5 two-way players. They're kind of building around their weaknesses, which was defense and rebounding, and Melton and Tucker will help a lot in that regard. Now, I am worried if that last year is fully guaranteed and he's 40, 41 years old, making $10 million a year, that could be a disaster. But it's also possible it's like the Danny Green deal where it was not guaranteed and then they were able to move him for De'Anthony Melton with the first-round pick at the draft. Morey likes to have tradable contracts. Keep that in mind. He always likes to have at least 1 or 2 of those around so that he can move it if he needs flexibility. As Bodner pointed out in his newsletter today, the Daily Six, he talked about the fact that Morey doesn't like to be hard capped. So if they use the full mid-level exception, they would be hard capped. But if you're not, just completely up against the hard cap, if Harden is willing to take that pay cut, then you might have a little bit of flexibility with how much money you can bring in and not necessarily be affected all that much by the hard cap. So I know his gut feeling said Tobias Harris would be traded, but I just don't really see a possibility. That's what I thought too. But it does seem like right now, Harden could potentially take a small pay cut to let PJ Tucker on the team. I feel much better about the team than I thought I would regarding this, just for next season at least. I think next season the Sixers will be fixing some of the issues that they had. Hopefully the young guys continue to develop. Hopefully Harden can get back to where he was before. And then on top of that, you have the fact that like PJ Tucker and De'Anthony Melton are good players and will help the Sixers a lot. And most of this podcast was discussing De'Anthony Melton and what he will bring to the Sixers. So enjoy this. I definitely have to record more. I will be streaming on Thursday as free agency starts. I definitely will have to record multiple episodes this week because of this. So I'll think of some ideas. This is way too short to kick off Slop week. Unfortunately, it was going to be like an hour and a half podcast, but now it's only going to be like fucking 30 minutes. So I will be back. Let me think of some ideas, not Sixers related. This will be the Sixers pod. Maybe I'll do some other, have some fans on from some other teams or some writers just to talk about what could potentially happen during the sloppiest week of the year. Free agency kicking off. We expect trades to come. DeJounte Murray apparently getting traded to the Atlanta Hawks. That's interesting. There's a lot of shit going on. So I appreciate you hanging with me here. I appreciate you guys understanding that unfortunately I cannot control the slop and when it drops. So enjoy. If you haven't already, subscribe, like, follow us on YouTube, anywhere you get your podcasts, all of that, review, do whatever you can. You can donate to the Square, buy merch, all of that stuff. Everything's in the description. So check it out. And also please check out Keith's podcast, Fastbreak Breakfast. And yeah, enjoy. I'll talk to you later in the week. Not that far in the week, hopefully. Peace. What's going on, guys? I am very excited to announce that Philly Sports Trips is now the official travel partner of the You Know Ball podcast. The biggest reason why I've partnered with Philly Sports Trips is really simple. I give them my money. I have a mini vacation that involves the Sixers, Eagles, and Phillies, and I don't have to lift a finger to plan anything. I can party as light as I want or as hard as I want, and Philly Sports Trips takes care of everything that I hate. The planning, the organizing, researching where to go. And I get a 5-star hotel, non-crazy flight schedules, and tailgates that have unbelievable food and booze. And most importantly, it's a douchebag-free zone. These are just some of the many reasons that I am excited to partner with Philly Sports Trips. I can't wait to go on a Sixers trip next season, and You Know Ball is absolutely going on the road to at least one Eagles game. So let me know which Eagles game you would want to go to, and I would love to do a huge You Know Ball road trip. Out of all the cities, I'm thinking New York or Chicago, but I want to know what you guys think as well. So tweet at me at TrillBroDude, DM me, comment on the YouTube, and let me know which Eagles game you guys think we should go as a group this season. Phillies and Eagles trips are booking right now. So head over to phillysportstrips.com and let them know that You Know Ball sent you for two very important reasons. Not only does it help fund the podcast, but we'll have VIP events and goodies specifically just for You Know Ball listeners. phillysportstrips.com, premium travel for every Philly sports fan, and a proud sponsor of the You Know Ball podcast. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, TrillBroDude, and today I am excited to have onto the podcast for the first time Keith Parish from Fast Break Breakfast, aka the #1 De'Anthony Melton stan. What's going on, Keith?
What's going on, Trill? I'm happy to be here. Thank you for acknowledging me as the #1 De'Anthony Melton fan. I believe I've earned it. I believe every now and then people come in and like they just show up and like there's appropriation. Zach Lowe every now and then will be like, oh, I'm the top Melton fan. And I'm like, no, I have worked for years at this. It is me. So thank you for acknowledging.
Of course. Yeah, you're the OG hipster Melton fan. Also, Chris Vernon, I know, huge Melton fan as well. He said,
you know, Chris Vernon is more well known than me. I feed Chris Vernon Melton stats. Been doing it for years. So I want you to know that. I have DMs, and I think Chris will admit this. I send him Melton stats. I did it for a long time. I was blowing his mind with like, do you realize the Grizzlies have outscored? There was one thing where it was like over the last 30 minutes that Ja and De'Anthony Melton have played together, the Grizzlies have won those minutes by 68. They were plus 68 in 30 minutes, not net rating, actual points. So like I was the one always finding these, sending them to Chris. Like, you got to talk about this. You have to get this as the mouthpiece. You have to get it to the masses.
Right. So you're kind of you're the ghostwriter. You're the guy behind the scenes that doesn't get credit. And Chris goes on his podcast that gets hundreds of thousands of listeners. And then we'll say these stats. And it's like, wow, amazing information that
Chris credits me. I'm not going to say he doesn't credit me. I'm not a total ghostwriter, but
okay.
Yeah, I was the one finding the stats, digging in there, minding the information.
So as the #1 Melton stan, we just have to talk a little bit up top about why Memphis made this trade, because I, as a person who, follows the league, I've liked Melton since he was coming out in the draft. He's always been an analytical darling, obviously. Daryl Morey drafted him. He ended up moving him. He never played for the Rockets. But it does seem like Melton is thought of very highly on NBA Twitter and by analytics nerds and all of that. So why did the Grizzlies move on from him is my question. Like, he's 24 years old. He makes $8 million a year. So was it a roster crunch, or what's going on with Melton, and why is he moved to the Sixers on draft night?
There are reasons that I think most of us Grizzlies analysts can come up with. But honestly, I feel like I'm faking it. Like, I'm kind of like making up reasons. This is the first move the Grizzlies have made in years where I was like, what? Like, why? Like, why do we do that? I think the thing we're pointing to the most is they're looking into the future and they're saying, we now know, like, Desmond Bane is going to make a ton of money in 2 seasons. And we're obviously paying Ja Morant next year. Jaren Jackson Jr.'s extension has kicked in. Next summer, it's going to be, do we re-sign Dylan Brooks? Do we give him an extension? Do we re-sign Brandon Clark? Do we keep Steven Adams? This team is going to get very, very expensive. And with the roster crunch, and maybe with them wanting to open up more of an opportunity for Zaire Williams to play the 2 guard, maybe they want to look at other guys. They drafted a bunch of wings type players, wing-ish, David Roddy, wing-ish people. Yeah. And it's like, all right, maybe they want to move a different direction. Maybe they have questions about the fit, which I would always push back at, but maybe they decided, listen, we have 5 or 6 people we prioritize more. Now's the time to reset the clock salary wise, to bring in guys on rookie scale deals, take a couple more swings through the draft and be able to move this guy out. And so that sort of makes sense. And I think that was the line of reasoning. The pushback to it is, well, he's young. He just turned 24. You're drafting guys who were 2 years younger than him. He's still on a relatively cheap contract for the next 2 seasons, but maybe they thought like, hey, we don't need $8 million cheap. We actually need rookie scale. We need 22nd pick, 23rd pick cheap. So that's the probable reason.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I do look at it as like, obviously they're going to have to pay a lot of guys. Memphis is in a smaller market. So generally speaking, those small market teams don't like to go deep into the tax. Obviously I think if the team was contending, and we expect them to in the coming years, that ownership might feel a little bit differently about that. But until we get to the point where Ja Morant is clearly the number 1 guy in a championship team, he's in his prime, I kind of understand resetting the timeline from their perspective, especially as we talked about pre-podcast with how good the Grizzlies are at drafting. Like, every year they get the draft Twitter darlings. They get the guys that everyone wants. David Roddy was a favorite of mine. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that I love about Melton is his fit with Harden and Maxey. So obviously, when you're looking for a 3rd guard to play with this guy, with those guys, you want someone who is a good catch and shoot guy, good perimeter defender, and a good rebounder. So you called him the 100th percentile guard rebounder in the NBA on Twitter a few weeks ago, I believe.
Well, that's the cleaning the glass for his position.
Okay.
For defensive rebounding, he's in the 100th percentile. And on, I believe, offensive rebounding, he's the 85th percentile. He's a phenomenal rebounder for his position.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly what the Sixers need. Obviously, one of the things last year was we all became dog-pilled because we were like, they don't have enough guys who hustle. They don't have enough guys who, will grind for rebounds and do role player things. And it seems like one of the things that Melton has done really well in his first few years in the league is he's been very malleable, and he's been able to, build up his 3-point shot. He's defensively is absolutely awesome. You also had another statistic that I thought was crazy. Him and Matisse Thybulle were number 1 and number 2 in deflections per minute and steal percentage in the NBA last year, I believe.
Yeah, I think they were 1 and 3 in deflections, but definitely 1 and 2 in steal percentage. Yeah, Melton he's a hustler. Like, that's his thing. The NBA hustle page, you find a lot of Melton. I was outraged that Marcus Smart won the hustle award. And then I found out that some arbitrary cutoff of like minutes per game that limited to like 100 people. By the way, they've still never let us know how that award was decided. There was no ballot. They just appointed Marcus Smart the hustle leader. Again, I've been trying to look into this, but yeah, like, Melton rebounds. He gets deflections. He's been top in deflections, in the last 2 seasons. The steal percentage, I believe the last 2 seasons combined, he's 3rd in steal percentage. He's 18th overall in just overall steals per game, but everyone ahead of him plays more minutes. It's similar to Tybal. Tybal, I don't know, we average maybe 25 minutes per game. Like Melton was around like 22 minutes per game. He's always near the top 10 in steals. And so he does all these hustle plays. And those are guys I always basically have an affinity to. I think my favorite player of all time is Tony Allen. And like Tony Allen is just like one of those things where you're like, people are like, oh, he can't shoot. And you're like, well, the Grizzlies offense is better when Tony Allen plays. And so like, because of all the extra possessions he generates, because of his cutting, because of his rebounding. And also, by the way, go look at Tony Allen's shooting percentages. He was around 50%. He didn't take shots he couldn't make, So like, anyway, when Melton came along, I thought there was a similarity where it's like, oh, this guy, he struggles to shoot. His shooting percentages the first year on the Grizzlies were terrible. And his shooting percentages on the Suns, they were terrible. But it's like, oh, this is a guard who just blocks shots and gets a tons of steals and rebounds. And those are the kinds of guys I love. And it was basically like, if that guy could ever learn how to shoot, he would be invaluable to any NBA franchise. Well, lo and behold, he hit 39% of his threes over the last 2 seasons.
Yep.
And so he's become like this super rotation guy, or like a glue guy, a bench guy, but he can knock down his threes and play defense. And it was just like, oh, this is everything we ever hoped for. At least for me, this is like a best case scenario. And so that's why it's like very disappointing. It's like, oh, well, now we've gotten rid of him. We're starting the clock over on someone else. Like, I hope maybe I'll fall in love with Vince Williams.
Yeah, honestly, you will definitely fall in love with David Roddy. Having watched a bunch of he just fits the ethos of the Grizzlies for sure. So I do. My thing about Melton is, though, like, once again, love the fit. I love the fit with Harden and Maxey as the third guard off the bench.
Specifically with Harden, like, not to cut you off, like the Harden and Melton backcourt pairing is ideal for me. Yeah. I mean, it's not ideal. Like, well, maybe Paul George would be better, but like as far as complementary players,
LeBron James,
a guard who can defend whoever the best opposing 1, 2, or 3 is for the other team. But like, he can take the harder guard matchup. He's a great rebounder. He hits 3-pointers. He rebounds. It's an ideal fit. I think with Maxey, it's not as clean, but like, they're still going to give teams a ton of trouble. Like, it's a good thing because he can guard 1s and he can guard 2s like comfortably. And then also, you don't want the ball in his hands, but like Maxey and Harden are going to have the ball in his hands. He's just going to do everything else. So I do think that fit is great. So
you mentioned him playing the 3, or at least guarding 3s. So Melton is 6'3", but he has a 6'9" wingspan, which is incredible for someone his height, especially someone who plays the 1, the 2, generally speaking. Do you think that they could get away with playing those Harden, Maxey, Melton lineups? Because if he can guard some 3s, then I think that my whole thing with 3s is like, how many starting small forwards can you name in the NBA that are like, there's like a handful of guys that aren't, generally speaking, the same size as like a shooting guard. So I do think that the small forward position is kind of becoming extinct. So like, do you think they could get away with those 3-guard lineups, kind of like Oklahoma City did a few years ago with Shea, Chris Paul, and Dennis Schroeder?
I think they definitely can. I think it's going to be a weapon that you can go to. Like, yeah, I said he can guard 3s. Like, he's going to have trouble with Brandon Ingram and Kevin Durant and Jason Tatum. It's like, well, yeah.
But who doesn't?
Yeah, literally everyone has trouble. And then when you start naming, like you're saying, you start naming the small forwards in the NBA, and then it's like you get to 10 and you're like, wait, is it Dylan Brooks? Like, are we at Dylan Brooks? He's 6'6", like it's not that. Are we talking Bogdan Bogdanovic? What are we talking about? Yeah. So I do think against most lineups, he can play the 3. And then depending, like the question is who's the 4? If it's obviously Tobias Harris, like I think that lineup, if it is Maxey, Harden, Melton, Tobias Harris, and Embiid, like that's kind of awesome. I'm a little bit worried about someone else needs a rebound besides Embiid and Melton. Like that would probably be an issue, but I definitely think for spurts, it's not going to be something you'd have to shy away from. You could definitely deploy it.
And one of the things that I've talked about consistently is kind of just like leaning into your strengths. And one of the things that is going to be incredibly important next year for the Sixers is finding guys who are good on catch and shoots. By the way, I have some stats from Derek Bodner here, and they were, you mentioned the 39% from 3 the past few seasons. He's 40% on catch and shoots, and he's 48.5 on corner 3s in that span, which is absolutely what the Sixers need, because our entire offense is going to be built around Maxey, or it's going to be built around Harden and Embiid pick and rolls with guys spacing in the corner. So if it's Tobias, maybe if they get PJ Tucker, if they figure that out, Melton, Maxey shooting threes, attacking closeouts, all that stuff, everything's going to kind of revolve around that. And if you have a bunch of guys who are 40% on catch and shoots, guys who can hit almost 50% from the corners, it makes that pick and roll seemingly unguardable. I think one of the things that the Sixers really struggled with last year, and like as good as Thibault is defensively, offensively, he can't stay on the court in big matchups because they can just ignore him. They can just completely leave him open in the corner, and then that kind of messes with the half-court offense. Whereas if you replace him with a guy like Melton, there's really nowhere to hide if you're a defense. It's just you're either going to give up an open corner three, or you're going to have to go, one-on-one against a Harden and Embiid pick and roll, and that sounds incredibly hard to guard.
Yeah, I will say, as far as Melton's shooting, we point to the in aggregate. All right, 37% last year, I think 41 the year before, and you point out those great numbers from the corners. He is still very streaky. I mean, all NBA shooters are streaky, but he's less of the like, all right, tonight I was 2 for 5, then I'm 1 for 5, then I'm 2 for 5, then I'm 3 for 5. He's like 0 for 5, 0 for 5, 0 for 5, like 3 straight games. Right. Like, oh, bro, you missed 15 straight. And then it's like the next 3, it's like, oh, you just made 12 out of 15. So like he's incredibly streaky. And that might be one of the reasons also where the Grizzlies were comfortable moving on from him. And I know the fan base definitely like pointed to some of his inconsistencies in the playoffs where his right. numbers are much lower, where he's more like a 30%, I think 27% from 3. And that's just like, I don't know what to make of it, where it's like, maybe that is a problem. Maybe he's not, maybe he's not a 16-game player. And then I also look at some of the guys who's like, well, Derek White, you saw that disappear. You've seen other shooters, Duncan Robinson, Tyler Hero, where like you get in the postseason, Grayson Allen even, where it's like, oh, all right, now, maybe you're a 22% three-point shooter in the playoffs. And that is going to be the question. I think, especially for the Sixers, you guys, you don't care about the regular season. You're trying to advance in the postseason. And so I think it's a perfect trade for the regular season. The question is going to be, is Melton's inconsistent three-point shooting over the previous postseasons, is that just a random product? Is it a random blip of one of his like little downswings? I would argue, as the number one fan and propagandist, one, it's a small sample size. Two, his role was never assured. Mm-hmm. They never gave him consistent minutes. It was some like in the Minnesota series, he played in a couple games and then they stopped playing him. And then it's like in the Utah series last year, where it's like, well, you played him 8 minutes. Who cares if you went 0 for 3 in the fourth quarter when you were down by 25? Like, we don't care. Yeah. We don't care about those stats. His garbage time stats, they're terrible. So it's like, I don't know. We're gonna have to see. Like, he had moments where he had game 2 against the Warriors where he went 1 for 5 from the field and was incredible. He had 2 steals and 2 blocks in the fourth quarter. He kind of swung that game, and that's the kind of stuff he does, where it's like, guys, when he shoots 20%, he's still positive. I always fall back to the net rating things. It's
starting to sound like Matisse Thybulle, but I will say that because of the fact that Melton at least has a shot that is a threat, that does matter. Yeah. I don't think that he'll ever get to the point where he'll be left completely wide open in the same way that Thybulle is. And regular season versus playoffs, obviously very different. One of the things I've kind of criticized Daryl Morey for, and I think he's done a pretty good job with a lot of things, but one of the things is that I've said he's invested a little bit too much into the regular season analytics, because it is 2 different games really. But once again, small sample, handful of minutes, handful of games. I do think that at worst, he's going to be a threat as a shooter. And I don't think defenses are going to challenge him to shoot wide open threes in the same way that they do with Matisse Thybulle, and they'll gladly concede that to him. But I just want to say, it does scare me a little bit, just because Sixers history with shooting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with our recent history of Markelle Fultz and Ben Simmons, who just never learned how to shoot. Thybulle, obviously. There's a handful of guys who just come to the Sixers and they either forget how to shoot.
Wait, are you guys going to break Melton? Are you telling me you're going to break Melton's shot?
No.
He's going to forget how to shoot a jumper? This is terrible news. The man taught himself to go from 26% from 3 to basically flirt with 40% the last 2 seasons. Now you've got me worried. I thought it was a great fit.
It is a great fit, but the only thing I'm saying is that there are 2 Sixers in my life that I can remember, actually 3, who had some of their best shooting seasons on the Sixers, and they're JJ Redick, Seth Curry, and Kyle Korver, who are 3 of the greatest shooters of all time. So our track record with that, but keep in mind, this was before we had the Harden and Embiid pick and roll. This was, Maxey's obviously come a long way in a short time as a 3-point shooter. He's become a very good one very quickly. And I think that ultimately a lot of this just comes down to like what the guys are made of, how they work on their game. And it seems like Melton works really hard and wants to continue to get better. You just mentioned he's 24, and we've had streaky shooters before. We had Robert Covington, Danny Green. My thought was, if he can play a little bit of the 3, or if they move on from Thibault, that Melton will like slot really nicely into that replacement role for either Danny or for Thibault if they choose to move on from him and get another rotation player that might be a little bit better. Because like I looked at these playoffs, and one of the things I kept saying is obviously we need help on the wing, but wings are impossible to acquire. If you can get a guy like Melton who can play like a wing, even though he's a little bit undersized, kind of like what the Warriors did with Gary Payton II, then that might be a little bit easier just from a team building standpoint to get to the point where you have basically 1 through 8, you have two-way players, guys who can stay on the court offensively and defensively. Because I think that these playoffs and the last few playoffs have proved if you have a weakness on either end of the court, by the end of a series, a team is going to completely exploit that. And I think that Melton, if everything translates from his regular season to the playoffs, makes it really hard to guard the Sixers, especially if they can acquire PJ Tucker as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, but then if you're talking about the postseason, you don't want to be depending, I don't think, on Melton to stop whoever it is. Like if it is KD, if he's still on the Nets, if it's Jason Tatum on the Celtics, like you're going to need, the Sixers are going to need a legit small forward, I think to get through those teams. Melton is not a panacea. He's not going to be the fix all. But he is going to be a guy, unlike Thibault, you won't be able to abandon in the corner. Also, he's similar in my mind to Robert Covington, where that's a streaky shooter, but he's a guy who he's a floor spacer. And so I think Melton will at least provide that.
Yeah. I mean, Sixers fans, whenever you bring up Robert Covington, there are a lot that like him, but there are a lot that get flashbacks to that Celtics series when he couldn't buy a fucking shot. And then, they have to replace him in the starting lineup with TJ McConnell by game 3. So our history with streaky shooters, especially in the playoffs, has been inconsistent, but ultimately the way that you optimize this offense is by putting those kind of players around Harden and Embiid. One last question that I have for you on Melton is one thing that I've heard some people be a little bit skeptical about his game, because we talked about everything that he's great at on offense and defense, but the one area is as a creator. Now, once again, keep in mind, he's not going to be asked to create that much here. We have 3 half-court creators in Maxey, Harden, and Embiid. We'll see what happens with Tobias Harris. Pretty much all of those guys can at least create their own shot. Some of them can create looks for others with either their passing or their gravity or whatever it is. So Melton will essentially be a spot-up shooter, but how is he just kind of attacking secondary action? So attacking a closeout, like if there are shots created from, because Memphis's offense, when I watch them, it's very collective. It's very much like everyone does a little bit of everything, and that's what makes them so hard to guard sometimes. Whereas the Sixers offense is like built around 2 stars, and then the role players just kind of have to do their job. So like, what do you think of Melton as a secondary creator and a guy who can attack closeouts if he is a shooting threat?
It's definitely a weak part of his game. You're not going to want to put the ball in his hands. Basically, you're never going to say, "Hey, go get a bucket." Like that's not his game at all. And even like as far as attacking, like closeouts, he's okay at it, but it's like he's not great. His 2-point field goal percentage last year was not good. Like again, a definite finishing is a weakness. I honestly think there were times watching him where I'm like, if he was maybe asked to do less, he might shine a little bit even more, because it's like he does have the turnovers where it's like he doesn't have a good feel for finding cutters, finding guys. He's a willing passer, and like he can throw alley-oops, like he can dribble a little bit, but you don't want him to be like your primary ball handler, initiator. In a situation where maybe it is always Harden attacking or Maxey attacking, it might work out a little bit better. But definitely that side of his game, it is a weakness. It's something, I'm sure he continues to work on, but you're never going to see him, I think, even as a secondary creator, like wow you with like, oh, he found that guy in the corner type thing. Like that is not, that he is not, He's capable. I'm trying to think of the right adjective, but he does not excel by any means at passing or attacking defenses off the dribble.
So I will say, as long as, and I love Danny Green, this is not Danny Green slander. Danny was great for us. He's had a great career. As long as he's better at attacking those closeouts than Danny Green, who that has been the weak.
I think he can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. A weakest point of his game for sure. I mean, anytime Danny puts the ball on the ground, we all scream. But I do think that, you know, his role will be simplified. I think he'll be my hope is that even though, I mean, per 36, I believe he puts up 8 threes per 36, which is perfect. If he could even put up a little bit more here as a spot up guy, I would absolutely love that. But as we kind of just wrap up here with the Melton stuff, like, so I know you got to get out of here soon. We just have to talk about who you guys took with the 23rd pick. We trade the 23rd pick. Obviously, I did not expect to get a player as good as Melton back. I was not looking forward to that at all. I thought we would have to at least include Thibault to get back a decent player like Melton. But you guys got David Roddy. Once again, the Grizzlies absolutely destroyed the draft. Jake LaRavia, who I had as like a top 20-ish prospect. David Roddy, who I loved. Kennedy Chandler, who I had as a top 20-ish prospect. And then my favorite of all, signing for the Summer League team, Kenneth Lofton Jr., I believe, will be playing alongside David Roddy, which will be absolute basketball heaven for ball listeners. So just tell me a little bit about like what you think about Roddy and what you think about the guys that you drafted.
Well, they fit a prototype. I mean, they fit what the Grizzlies go for. They're the draft Twitter darlings. They get the guys who have whatever it is, the steal and the block rates and the rebounders. They have high effective field goal percentage, and they're ball players. They can do things on the court. They are comfortable passing. They're comfortable with the ball in their hands. And I think it's a sizing up, not counting Kennedy Chandler. They're just getting guys who are a little bit bigger, taller than Melton, better wingspans than Melton even. And so it looks like maybe that was the idea. LaRavia seems like maybe, I don't know if he can plug and play and fill in with what they're losing in Kyle Anderson. Roddy, I'm not a draft guy. I'm not a college basketball watcher. Everyone tells me I'm just going to adore him because he's just like, he's delightfully fun to watch. Great. Yeah, I mean, I saw the dimensions and I'm like, oh, beautiful. Like, sign me up. It's funny.
He's a linebacker.
The one of these guys that I've actually seen play basketball is Kenny Lofton, because I watched like the under-19s a couple years ago, and he was putting the hurt on Wembanyama. So I'm like, oh, I got rules. So everyone's like, he doesn't project to be NBA. I'm like, but he's girthy and cool. So So I'm excited to see Summer League.
We said on our pre-draft show that if David Roddy and Kenneth Lofton Jr. look like Kendall Brown from Baylor, that they would be lottery picks. It's just the fact that they look so weird that people just are like, that's like, I don't think Kenneth Lofton is an NBA player, but David Roddy, I'm very excited for. I hope that the defense can actually keep him on the court at an NBA level. That's the only thing I worry about, but his offense is awesome. I think he's going to slot in as a really nice role player. And all the guys you got, except for Kennedy Chandler, who's a primary ball handler, are all fantastic. If you want to just plug them into a system like the Grizzlies, like Jake LaRavia, I think he'll be able to play as a rookie, and I think he'll be pretty good. Like, I think like someone compared him, they said he's like Dario Saric with 20% more athleticism, which I loved. And like, kind of just like, I think he's going to be a really good shooter, good connective passer. So once again, Grizzlies absolutely destroy the draft. I know you got to get out of here, so I want to let you get out, but thank you so much for coming on, Keith, and talking to me about Melton and the draft.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Peace, bud.
Thanks, man.